Hello, it's live with CCO. We're on episode number 57. We get questions a lot about different forms and the in the outpatient and inpatient realms that aren't often talked about. However, if you're working in a doctor's office or even in a hospital, especially one of these probably pertains more to um, inpatient and the ER, you will come across these forms and may even be asked to participate in filling them out. So it's important that you have a knowledge base regarding them. So, some medical forms that you need to know is the ABN form, and we've talked about this before, so you can go to our YouTube channel and search ABN, the AMA form, and the DNR. The ABN is Advanced Beneficiary Notice, the AMA is Against Medical Advice, and the DNR is Do Not Resuscitate. So these three forms are just three that you could come across in working again in a doctor's office or say a hospital emergency room, or even if you're working in a hospital on the floor, then you will see these forms possibly. We're going to talk about them kind of briefly. The goal is to not explain them completely from top to bottom, but to give you insight, and that if you need more information, you can do some research above and beyond that. Again, we have talked about the advanced beneficiary notice before and did a pretty extensive um, breakdown of what it is and criteria and so on. So let's get started with the ABN first, the Advanced Beneficiary Notice. It is a form that's used to transfer potential financial liability. So ultimately, what this means is you have a patient that comes in that is on Medicare. Now, this is used for Medicare, but you could use this for other payers, but it's most talked about with Medicare. So the patient comes in, the provider talks to the patient, and there's a service or a procedure that they feel that the patient needs. However, it's not covered by their payer or by Medicare. In that case, knowing in advance that it's not covered, then this is a form to fill out so that the patient and the provider and the payer all know that the cost that's not covered will be paid by the patient. So the patient is entitled to know that it may not be covered. They're entitled to know that the expected cost of this particular procedure or test, and what their possible uh, income or liability will be for that, meaning how much they will be responsible for being paid. And it's not always the full amount. Sometimes Medicare will pay a portion, but it's not covered in full, and therefore that information is all put in this form, and the patient signs off and says, yes, I understand this is going to be a $500 procedure. Medicare will pay $300, but I'm responsible for $200 to the provider for having this test done. And again, it's relatively simple. Those are the basic steps and what's required. However, it's important to know that there might be other scenarios or situations where you could use this advanced beneficiary notice. It's predominantly used, for Medicare, but it helps everybody make sure that they're on the same page. So it protects the provider. It also protects the patient so that they can't say, well, you didn't tell me I was going to have to pay $500 out of pocket. And they say, you didn't explain what this procedure was and it entailed, and how much I could pay. And by having this all written down in this form, then the patient is protected. They know going in, if they choose to have this done, that that will be their liability or responsibility to pay, and no one can come back and get upset or state that they didn't understand. Again, this is usually things in Medicare that could be experimental, or that they could be discontinued services that aren't normally used. Also, it could be maybe the medical necessity isn't there for that procedure to be paid for by the payer, and yet the provider and the patient feel like it would be beneficial, so they decide to go ahead and do it. And again, that would be a reason to fill out the form stating, yes, I know it's going to be expensive. Uh, now, there are a lot of procedures, tests, medications and things that aren't approved yet to be covered by Medicare, or not safe or proven effective is, I guess, the way that they state it. However, the patient and the provider decide together that they want to give this a try. One of the things that pops up in my brain is a story about shingles, and there is something that can be done to treat shingles. Usually it's just trying to help the patient be as comfortable as possible, but it's quite painful to have this rash. And I don't know the details. I've done a little research, but it's been a while. But there is a procedure that can be done, but the provider has to be trained in how to do this, and the it's not really a drug, but the poultice, I guess you could say, that was created to alleviate the pain is not something that's very, very common. Now, it's not like you think of the going out and getting herbs and stuff like that. It's not that. This is something that is synthesized or created. You would have to order it, and you'd get it from the pharmacy. But it's this paste or cream that's made out of this really hot chili pepper of some type, and got some other stuff in it. But you could put that on the shingles area. Ultimately, it kind of burns out the nerves, uh, but again, you have to be trained to use it. It's very expensive, and it's definitely not covered. So I've heard of people having tried this and it was effective and it worked, but they paid out of pocket, and they would have filled an ABN. And not all providers are trained to administer this topical um, analgesic, I guess you could kind of say. But again, uh, from what I understand, it's very effective. However, and I had asked, "How come we're not giving it to our shingles patients?" And they explained, "Well, this is why. It's not readily available, it's expensive, and you can't just put it on there because it literally burns the skin as well, or can burn the skin as well as the nerve endings, kind of deadening them." So that would be an example of Medicare's not even gonna go there, right? Uh, uh, until and maybe they'll eventually develop something that works better and has better control and less training needed to be able to use it. But again, you may be able to think of some other scenarios or situations where an advanced beneficiary notice is filled out. Again, we do have put up in the chat our other YouTube video that we created on the ABN. I see that posted there. Now, let's see. On the ABN, it also serves as proof. I just wanted to wrap up by saying that the beneficiary or the patient is advised. Okay, so it's a paper that you have all that information, their liability or risk, or how much it's going to pay out of pocket. And it is notable that if the provider doesn't give an ABN and all clicked all the boxes and done it correctly, then the provider will end up paying. out for the procedure. So if you are in a clinic that works with an ABN, you want to make sure that everybody in the clinic that is working with those are properly trained on making sure, all the T's are crossed and all the I's are dotted. Or again, the provider in the clinic could be out of pocket. Let's see. Sarah says, can you have a signed ABM form with a date range, as in the patient having treatment over 3 to 6 months and we know it's not covered? Or does it need to be a date of service specific? No, it can have a range. That is a good question. And I have linked at the resource page at the end of the slide deck that you can reference, and the CMS site is where I pulled this information, and they have a PDF on the proper use of an ABN, and you can have the date ranges put in there. However, you have to also make it very clear that if there is any outside window of that date range, then uh, it it could you could be out of pocket, right? The provider could be out of pocket. So when you say a 3 month procedural, you could say that. However, you could also write it to reflect that this procedure will be done. This is the cost, the expected cost, because you don't have to have it down to the penny. This is the expected cost, and that's where you get into um, some gray areas. But most everything we can say how much it's going to be. But if you say, "Oh, we expect it to cost $500," and it ends up being 550, it's that's okay. But if you tell the patient that you expect it to be $500 and it's $1,000, then you're going to fall into some problems, and they could come back and say, well, I wasn't given uh, a clear understanding of what my liability would have been, and rightly so. So but for a date range, that's not as important as the total cost. So you might want to be ambiguous in the date range and state that this is a service that's going to be performed, and the standard would be, 4 treatments, and those 4 treatments would be expected to cost X amount of dollars, and that anything above and beyond that would, make it very clear, would necessitate another ABN, or uh, um, talking about that possibly it wasn't working, so we're not going to do it anymore, or this is working, so we're going to continue the procedures, and then clarify, and I would just have another ABN filled out. So again, there's examples of ABNs that are used. If you're in a clinic system that is a larger system, maybe part of a practice group or a hospital clinic system, they would have an ABN form that they use as standard. um, Deborah says an ABN is usually good for a year from the date of signing. And that's good to note, Deborah, in stating that, because a patient, you can't like put a date on there and the patients say, okay, well, I'll think about it. They sign it. And then 3 months later, they come back and decide to have the procedure and say, oh, yeah, but I signed that 3 months ago. I didn't know that that was going to be that amount of money. So just be very, very clear that it's important to have what the expected costs are going to be for the procedure, or the service, and what that is, the description of what it is clearly done. That's key. Again, CMS has that information, and it's at there at the end. Moving on to the AMA, this is against medical advice. Most of the time, you're going to see these in ERs. You're going to see them in outpatient or observation status for a patient. You don't see these in doctors' offices really, because now there might be scenarios. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. And when I was preparing these slides, I couldn't think of anything in a clinic itself. uh, uh, because it is more so geared towards the patient is already been admitted to the care of the emergency room, okay, or has is being seen in observation status or inpatient status, and they say, "I'm out of here. I'm going home." You know, um, a lot of times, this might be related to people who have cognitive altered mental status. It not necessarily that they, or they may be, and when I say altered mental status, that's a very broad spectrum of things that could have happened. Meaning the patient doesn't have the cognitive ability to make a good decision, and the facility or the provider doesn't want to be held responsible. They've explained it, and the patient says, "No, I'm going home." Uh, or the patient is inebriated or is under the influences of substances, and again needs to stay for observation or care, and the provider wants that liability taken away from them, saying, "This is against my advice. You need to stay here for your own health," right? Um, and they can choose to go home. You can't kidnap per somebody and keep them there against their will, even if it's a bad decision. The caveat to that, though, is if the provider feels that this is, detrimental to the patient, that's one thing. The patients can make those decisions for themselves. If they are going to be somebody else, or uh, they could be uh, a health hazard to somebody else, then they can keep them. Okay. And that would be, for example, if you had tuberculosis and they have you in the hospital and you say, "Nope, I'm going home." Well, you can't leave when you have tuberculosis, because it is a contagious disease and you have to be quarantined. And you can be quarantined at home, but there's rules and laws regarding certain diseases, like that are communicable, that like tuberculosis, and they can put you in jail. Actually, it's kind of an interesting side story. Uh, but remember Typhoid Mary? Do you remember that story? It's kind of like that. So if a patient goes into the ER, and the doctor does an chest X-ray, and they determine that the patient has tuberculosis, and the patient says, "Nope, I'm out of here. I'm going home." Then again, then the authorities would be involved, where they say, "Well, no, you can't go home and be walking around exposing other people to tuberculosis." But that is something completely different. That is not comparing apples to apples, in other words. But as far as against medical advice, the interesting thing is a study was done, an abstract was done, and I took this information from that. Again, it's bookmarked, or it's linked at the end in the resource slide, that between 1% and 2% of all medical admissions result in an AMA discharge. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot, okay? But when you think about it, uh, nationally, then that's significant. That's a lot of people. So they were saying probably one of the predictors of AMAs, based on their study, was and other studies, is that it tends to be younger people versus older people that decide to go ahead and go home. And they either are on state provided insurance, or they have no insurance at all. Males tend to go AMA more than females, which I just thought that was kind of interesting, because we always joke about, you can't hardly get a man to go to the doctor, let alone, stay. And they also noted that they have a current or history of substance or alcohol abuse. Now, again, this is just a study and doing retrospective look at the studies and the information that they're compiling from the studies. There really had not been a significant study, they stated, before the one they were doing on the statistics regarding AMA. But there was a need to help reduce the AMAs happening, uh, uh, because there is an added expense to the facility, because those people usually would leave, then something else would happen, and they would come back in worse shape than they were. Or when you go against medical advice, there's a reason why they want you to stay, right? And so that could end up costing, again, the facility more, the payers more, and the patients more, or result in death. Uh, the this statement here is again from the study, and what more or less summing up what I was saying is that it exposes the patient to the risk of inadequately being treated for what they came to the ER, the hospital, for in the first place, and results in readmission. Now, there are studies taken on readmissions for specific diseases, but there really hadn't been a study based on AMA readmissions, but that is a statistic. Readmissions is a statistic that is tracked. Now, they also stated that, there is this ethical dilemma that is put forward here. What does the provider do? Where does their responsibility end in doing no harm? Uh, you know, Trying to reflect the necessity in a very straightforward way that, hey, this could be a lot, this is life threatening, or that, the outcome is not good. Uh, and saying, and letting that patient go, knowing that they could succumb to whatever brought them there in the first place, right? And so that weighs heavy on our providers, knowing that, but again, if you can't make somebody do something, even if it's life threatening, there's a point there where the patient gets to decide what is best for them. Now, uh, just wrapping up AMAs, and some of you may have already been exposed to AMA. If you worked in ER, you saw it a lot, and I have seen several of them, and I think all but one of those, the person was intoxicated. um, and the one that wasn't, they wanted to transport the patient to another facility, and they wanted to do it via ambulance, and the patient said no, they would go on their own. And that was against medical advice. They needed to be monitored because they were in a, but I don't remember all the details. Mind you, this was almost 30 years ago. But again, it was a transport issue. The patient didn't feel like they needed to be monitored, or they wanted the expense that they were going to have to pay out of pocket because of payer, like we said. And so they were going to get a family member to transport them the hour drive to the bigger facility. And I'm they went, and I think everything went okay. But at that point, there's no responsibility to the facility or the doctor to really find out. So you may or may not sometimes find out in those scenarios. Um, Deborah says there's samples of forms in English and Spanish in the CMS link posted earlier. Thank you for bringing that up, Deborah, because being in multiple languages is very, very important. For the AMA, I know the ABN is there. Oh, okay, Deborah. And again, I'm sure AMA forms are pretty standard. Uh, and Sophie had come in late and says against medical advice is what the AMA states. So, there we go. Okay. And oh, but there is one for the military that they use. Whew, okay. AMA forms the military use. Okay, thanks for finding that, Jesus. So again, AMA is rather more common than you think. It is your right to walk away and to seek other treatment even. So if you were to say, okay, you've told me what's wrong with me, that, I have pneumonia. I feel a little bit better. You gave me a breathing treatment. You want to admit me. I don't want to be admitted. I want to go home and I'll go see my doctor tomorrow because I feel better now. And the doctor's saying, no, we really need to keep you in and observe you. We need to monitor your breathing. Your O2 stats are too low. And you have comorbidities, this is not a good idea. And the patient says, no, I'm going to wait till tomorrow. I feel better. Thanks for fixing me up, doc, but I'm going home. And that was actually the name of the study was I'm going home. And that's what you hear. But most of the time in those scenarios where it kind of came up where that patient was starting to get frustrated and they don't feel good, they're out of their comfort zones, the ER or wherever you're at is usually really, really busy. They don't have a patient advocate. They don't feel like somebody's listening to them sometimes. Or again, you can have language issues. uh, uh, Cognitive deficits for whatever reason, meaning maybe the patient is inebriated or not, substances are involved. And communication really is the key to prevent a patient leaving AMA. But if you want to make somebody hot, I was talking to somebody the other day and they stated that refusal to refusal to fill out an AMA form, because the patient can say, no, I'm not even going to fill that out. I'm not even going to sign it. And that's fine. Then you note that the patient, left AMA, refused to sign form, and then, witness it and everything. Uh, that someone had said that they did that to the clinic, or the hospital did that to them, and they were pretty hot. But again, it all boiled down to miscommunication. And so this type of information stays in a medical record. It's documented, and that could cause problems with payers if you do have insurance and they say, wait a minute, you left. So make sure that the patient communication is good, and that all the ancillary staff too is being friendly and as helpful as possible. And sometimes it's not easy. But that informed consent, and if there's any underlying psychiatric issues, they can all be relevant. And practice management usually gets involved when those situations occur. Sarah says she had a silly question. If you get in a car accident and refuse an ambulance, do they file an ANA form, and would they store that information? Uh, no, it's not the same. It's not called an AMA form, but it's very similar. So my time on the ambulance, working with them, uh, you can refuse to be transported, but they fill out a form because they've been put on a call, right? So anytime they're called out, the clock starts ticking and they start filling out documentation as to, where they're going, why they're going there. Even if it was I don't want to say false alarm, a false call. I don't remember what we called those. I can't remember. But where, sometimes you get called out on a hoax or something. There was nobody there. You couldn't find them, or whatever. You filled out the documentation and you stated that. If you go up on a moving vehicle accident, you were called not by the patient or the person that was injured, then they can refuse treatment, and you would just document that, and it would be stored in your records. But it if an insurance company wanted to come back and say you were the ambulance service that was called, what happened? Yes, then you would say this is the form. We filled out. We got there. The patient said they didn't want to be transported. If you touch that patient or initiate any care, the paperwork starts also for that. That's all tracked and documented. And you would say that you strongly encouraged that patient to be transported to the facility, but they said no, they'd get there on their own, and they signed off on it. And they don't even have to sign, but you usually encourage them to sign off and say that, we explained that we offered to transport you, and you chose to go on your own. Now, refusable form for EMS. That is one of the forms that is used. Now, uh, if you call and the EMS comes to your door, then you would fill out one of those forms. If you come up on a motor vehicle accident and they didn't call you, somebody else did, and you never touched the patient or had any interaction except for to offer your services at some point, um, and you say, "Hey, do you want us to check you out? Can we check you out?" And they say, "No, I'm fine." Then no, they don't have to fill that form out or sign anything. Um, and you would still put in your reports that you were called out to this particular service, and all that stuff's recorded. The audio is all recorded, and then you would fill out the forms in your report. However, again, it all has to do with the legalese part of when you actually touch the patient and so on. But again, uh, it's a little bit different, but the same concept. When care is initiated, and so much for EMS. Very good question, Sarah. Thanks for bringing that up so that we could distinguish the difference in that. The next is a DNR, or a Do Not Resuscitate. Some of you may be more familiar with this one because you hear this on TV sometimes in shows, and or that the patient has a DNR. Um, this is this is this can be in several levels of care for a patient, but for the most part, when you boil down all the possibilities in a DNR, what it means is to do not resuscitate. Okay. And this is a medical order that has to be written. The provider and the patient have to come to this, um, uh, have to have a meeting together and counsel with each other to complete this order. So the patient would say, I want to have a DNR, or the provider would initiate the conversation and say, what are your wishes? Have you established that at this point in your care? In fact, it's part of standard care now, especially when you do like your annual wellness visit. They, do you have this type of paperwork initiated, and how can I help you by answering any questions? Uh, and from that point on, living wills, right, Alanda? Um, Having that all established, it is a metric that they track to make sure that again, we don't want, it's best whatever's best for the patient, in that if this is a scenario, or that we don't want it to be too late when you have to make those decisions. Your family has to make those decisions if you have specific decisions or choices that you've made that you want to be fulfilled. So a do not resuscitate really goes along with don't do CPR. Don't do cardiopulmonary resuscitation. And that doesn't mean, like if you fall down in the street, that someone can't do CPR on you, because they wouldn't know. However, if you get to the hospital and they're doing CPR on you, and they transport you, and they open up your file and they say this patient has a DNR, um, uh, then you stop. And so, again, it is helping the patient breathe, and the pumping of the heart. That is a do not resuscitate. Now, there is all different types of levels of decisions that can be done with DNRs. You could have written into the orders that, I I don't want to have CPR performed on me, but if you need to intubate me, and what level of care do you want? So it's not really a DNR per se. It's a little bit different, and it ends up being more like a living will at that point. These are the procedures and things that I want to do that are interventional or invasive, and these are the ones that I don't wish to have happen. But for a DNR, it strictly means they're not going to perform CPR on you if you stop breathing or if your heart fails. Now, you see this a lot in hospice care, and hospice has gotten to be such a huge beneficial um, service that's provided to our communities, and they are often overlooked in the benefits of having hospice care. We've had several family members that have passed away with hospice care, and I can tell you it is the best decision making that has been done for that patient. They've been able to have hospice at a facility, and they've also been able to pass away at home with the assistance of the hospice team. And again, truly, it's an amazing service that's offered. It does not mean that your patient is going to die immediately to have someone go on hospice. So I would encourage you to educate yourself on hospice and the services that they provide. But when the provider sits down and talks to the patient about it might be time to consider hospice, everybody usually backs up and goes, wait a minute, I'm going to die tomorrow. No, that's not what that means. But hospice is available to has the ability to provide services that you can't get at a hospital, that's difficult on the patient who is already at a level of possibly even discomfort or care that's needed, that needs to be at a higher level, but they want to be at home and comfortable. They don't want to be going in and out of the hospital system. And so it's kind of like bringing the hospital home to your home. Now, they will focus on having a DNR because that's part of the level of what they do. There's difference between palliative care and hospice. So do your um, look into that and become familiar with the differences. But again, it is often part of the hospice um, scenario. Now, uh, the DNR is an order, and it has to be filled out. The form has to be filled out by the provider, and it is submitted into the medical record, so it becomes a legal document. They can also, the provider will probably educate at that time the patient and let them know there's several things that will be beneficial to you to maintain your wishes and assistive to your family members, like getting a wallet card, getting a bracelet, or have some other type of documentation that is not in the hospital, or otherwise, if something happens to you, everybody's going to call the ambulance and your wishes won't be fulfilled, and they'll take you in and start treating you, and again, that may be against what you want to have happened. The standard forms are available on all different state departments of health. There is probably a little bit of tweaking that could be different from one state to another. I'm not familiar with that, but you absolutely can get that off the link that I put at the end. CMS will have that information, as well as all of your state health services, your HHSs. Let's see. Deborah says, my father lasted 17 days in hospice and they provided palliative care to keep the patient comfortable. Absolutely. And most people that go on hospice, they can be on hospice for a year, and they get, in my opinion, they get better care than they ever could have gotten without hospice, because, again, they're not being transported back and forth. They have immediate um, on-call help, and that conversation goes straight to the doctor. There's no delay. There's no trying to get in to see the doctor, and so on and so forth. So there's just so many benefits. Uh, my father-in-law was on hospice, and my uh, brother-in-law both, and they was awesome. I've had other people that have passed with hospice. Deborah says, "Can a living will take the place of a DNR?" Yes. Yeah, a living will have the DNR included in it, so it would be a component of the living will. Yeah, so it again, it's all combined, like Alexander said, it's a component or part of the living will. The living will is an expanded version of everything that you want to have done. The DNR is do not resuscitate. In other words, don't do CPR. Lori says Z66. I always remember that code after not being able to find it as a student. There you go. Perfect, Lori. And Lori, is our CCO. She works with us. She's fabulous. That's great. Jack says my grandmother lasted less than 16 hours, some same day after hospice certification. Certainly interesting having the billing. Yeah, yeah. The again. Sometimes I think that maybe that conversation comes a little late in the disease processes, and other times it comes way ahead of time. But that's why it's important to have these documents in place and for you to be familiar with them, not only on a personal level, but also so that you can help that patient and provider communication, uh, because ultimately, as I said before, this is all about the best care that we can provide to our patients, and these documents fall into that category, into that care. So again, we want to make us as knowledgeable as possible. Now, again, there's the resources that I used, and I encourage you to continue to look up different forms that you'll come across. As a medical coder biller, the billing part, you will probably see these documents absolutely in ABN, but you may not. However, the knowledge and understanding about when you see this documented and those codes like Z66, yeah, you'll be familiar with them and not have to go looking for them. Jack says, have that conversation. At least you will have at least some reference in case you're left to make the call. And that's ultimately what happens is just having an open conversation with your family members. And it should be done in a comfortable setting, and so that your children or your parents make sure that everybody knows what their wishes uh, are, because I've been in that scenario many of time, observing people in that uncomfortable situation where they have to make decisions for family members, and that burden, as well as having to do that for my own uh, family. So have those conversations early. Deborah says each state has its own laws. Check out the state laws for the proper forms and wording. Absolutely, Deborah. Those that is correct. The ABN is pretty standard. CMS, the DNR, no. It is going to be individualized. AMAs will be corporate driven or organizationally driven. In other words, if you work for a doctor in his doctor office, you're not going to really come across it that much. But if you work for a hospital, they will have a standard form that's been approved by their compliance department, and all that legalese information has already been taken care of. Yeah. Let's see. All healthcare surrogates would allow you to make that call. Yeah. Yes, a healthcare surrogate, and some people at least think about having someone be in charge of your estate, or to make those decisions for you. Have a person down that is going to be the executor for you, and whether it be someone in your family or someone even better yet that's outside of your family, that no one, I would never want somebody in my family to be the executor of an estate. It's not a fun task. I wouldn't advise anybody to volunteer or offer to do that. Okay, and conservatorships. Yes, Jack states you might come across a conservatorship. That too will happen. And again, that all plays a part in, when it really comes into play is those annual wellness visits, when the provider gets all of that information down, and so that it can be put in the medical record and will save time, and you can go from that point on, right? It's brilliant to let your provider know that you have a living will, that you do or do not have, or even organ donor, right? They ask you when you do your driver's license, but again, that's a conversation that's good to have. Let's see. Deborah says you should be able to find a lawyer who will do these forms inexpensively because she's a paralegal. Thank you, Deborah. No wonder you're so in tune to this, and that's correct. This is pretty. It's not necessarily simplistic, but it's very common and standard, and then you can get all of this geared to your personal wishes, so you can tweak them and or maybe you just are straightforward and know exactly what you want to have done. All right. So thank you guys for joining us. Again, we have so much fun offering these webinars to you. If you have a topic that you would like for us to talk about that you think would be beneficial, not only to you, but to others, then let us know. You can find the place to let us know at cco.us/topic request. And we will absolutely do some research. I've been saying this more and more lately, that I hope or that our goal is to start you with the information, get you in the right place, and then hopefully that spurs you to do further investigation on your own to increase your knowledge base. It isn't a good idea to be spoon-fed knowledge always. It's hopefully triggering the curiosity to where you go and jump in and say, yeah, I want to learn more about that disease process or that particular code and scenarios that surround that. Or like we talked about today, where these particular forms you may or may not come across, but you're knowledgeable about them. So if you do have to experience them, whether on your own or in your career path, then you have a basis to do further investigating going forward. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you again next time. Don't forget, like, subscribe, hit the bell, do all that other great stuff that we like to have you do on the social medias, and tell everybody else about us. We'd appreciate that too. Thank you.
Do you need more medical certification and business training? Learn more at www.cco.us.